is Art Bowser. I am a follower of the Comics Alternative with the two guys with PhDs, and I just love it, and I am a Patreon helper. I donate a little bit, and you should too.
This is the Comics Alternative Manga, reviews of the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service, Omnibus 1, and One Punch Man, Volumes 1 and 2. Hello, and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative Manga. I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
And we're two educated guys talking about manga. And on this month's show, we're going to be looking at two really interesting but different titles. We're going to begin by looking at the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service Omnibus, Volume 1. And then after that, we're going to look at Volumes 1 and 2 of One Punch Man. But before we get to those discussions, we want to let all of you know that this episode of the Comics Alternative Manga is brought to you by the wonderful folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics and manga pre-ordering needs. There you'll find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover prices if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, including September, you're going to find some unbelievable specials. Now, sometimes you'll find specials at 45% off cover price, sometimes as much as 50% off cover price, but believe it or not, you can find discounts that are much more impressive than that.
Yeah, like in September, you can get the Comic Book Legal Defense Fund presents Manga, the Introductions, Challenges, and Best Practices book, for 45% off, and you can get this Spawn manga that Image put out a couple years ago for 45% off.
So there are a lot of discounts in September, and even though we're about at the tail end of the month, you can still take advantage of those specials. But you have to go to the website to see what they are. That's dcbservice.com. You go there for all of your manga pre-ordering needs. And after you do get your manga there, please be sure to get in touch with them and let them know that the two guys with PhDs sent you. So, Shea, it is another month, and it's another time for you and I to talk about manga, and we have some interesting titles to discuss this month. But how have things been with you since we last talked?
Pretty good. I have not done a very good job of reading comics, though. I will admit to that. Mostly, I've just been reading stuff that I need to write about. So I've got a pile about as tall as me accruing in my bedroom on my nightstand. But other than that, I've pretty good. What about you? I know you recently started a new job. Yeah,
and I'm out there where you are at UT Dallas. You're going there, and that's basically where I am as well. Is that I've been able to read things for the podcast, but sometimes just barely. Getting ready for classes, getting into the first month or so of classes, it's a lot, and I'm sure that you're experiencing the same right now. And you have other responsibilities where you're doing reviews.
Yeah, so I'm with you. School is taking up most of my time. Like, I'm sure it's taking up most of yours, but what are you going to do? I paid a lot of money for it, so I should prioritize it.
Yeah. Well, I know one thing we're going to do, and that's talk about some manga.
That's right.
So the first title that we're going to be discussing on this month's show is the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service. This is written by Eiji Otsuka and with art by Housui, Yamazaki. And I hope I'm pronouncing those names correctly.
That is how I would pronounce it. So as we have established, I could be completely wrong, but we'll be wrong together.
Yes. Now, one of the reasons why we wanted to focus on this one is, well, it's a great story, a great series, but Dark Horse just published the first omnibus of the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service. And, Shea, this is something that Dark Horse has been doing more of over the past several months, and that is taking some of the manga titles that they have been publishing and packaging them as omnibuses. So, last month we talked about Oh My Goddess, which is one that they had been publishing, or they continue to do so, but then they decided to put it out in omnibus form. Same thing with the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service. Now, this omnibus includes the first 3 volumes of the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service. And I have to say, I did not get the omnibus because I have been getting the individual volumes of this title for several years now. But I did take a look at the review PDF of the Corpse Delivery Service, and they indicate at the very beginning that what makes up the omnibus is exactly what you'll find in the first 3 volumes.
Yeah, this, I looked like you, I looked at the PDF, but this is different from the other Dark Horse omnibuses that I've read, because it's much more like the 3 regular paperbacks kind of combined, and they even have each volume has its own table of contents within the omnibus, and so every third through the book there's a title page, and then there's the page numbers that the different chapters are on, and it starts renumbering the pages. So I've read the Lone Wolf and Cub and the Samurai Executioner omnibuses and the Oh My Goddess omnibus, which we talked about last month, and so even the format of this was very different. But yeah, it's very, very clearly just the first 3 paperbacks combined. They do make that very, very clear throughout the book. That's
interesting. And they also just recently came out with the first Astro Boy omnibus. And I haven't looked at that yet, or at least looked at it inside. I'm wondering why they're doing things differently with the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service, especially in terms of the pagination.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just the design differences. It could be different editors or something like that. But that is it. I don't know. It's weird though. I guess I would expect them to be kind of uniform. But I mean, I haven't looked at the physical format, the physical omnibus for this. But the Samurai Execution omnibuses and the Lone Wolf and Cub omnibuses are really similar, but then the Oh My Goddess omnibus it's a much bigger size and different kind of paper. So we are seeing some differences between the titles. So it might come down to just different editors that want different things or something like that.
Now, I know that you were aware of this title before we read the omnibus, but had you read any of the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service before this month?
I hadn't, and I got to admit, reading it, it is not the book I thought it was. It's much more of a horror-oriented book than I had expected it to be, based on because I had only seen the covers, and I really do like the design of those paperbacks, which they kind of kept for this omnibus. That diagrammatic cover and the almost cardboard paper stock. I really like that, but it gave me the idea that it was some sort of sci-fi title, and so I had gone in expecting there to be some sci-fi element, and it turns out there's not that at all. I had the series completely wrong, but I will admit that's on me, not on them. That's my prejudices. But
if you were a little surprised or you got a little something that you didn't expect, was that in a good way?
I think that was neither good nor bad. It was simply my preconceived notions were wrong, but they didn't make me like or dislike the series anymore.
Okay. Well, I ask because the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service is actually one of the first manga series that I ever read. And this was a number of years ago. I just felt like I needed to read manga or more manga, become familiar with it. And I can't remember how I came across it, but I found a reference to it somewhere. So I got the first few volumes from Dark Horse and then started to read that. And then along with that, I also picked up Eiji Otsuka's Psycho MPD, which is much, much, much darker than Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service. But, you mentioned this being a horror title. It's funny. When you go to the Dark Horse website, when you go to Amazon, any place that describes what the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service is, they list it as manga horror. And I really never saw it that way, and I still don't, going back and rereading the first 3 volumes, which make up the Omnibus. It does deal with horror elements, especially when you're talking about the dead. And there are several instances in the first 3 volumes or in this Omnibus where certain characters do come back from the dead. But it's not horror in the same way that we've discussed it before on the podcast, especially in terms of Junji Ito's work. I mean, that is horror.
Yeah.
That is spooky. And I think the thing about what Otsuka does in his writing is it's very humorous. And so I wouldn't call this a horror title. I would call, if I included horror in it, I'd call it humorous horror or funny horror or lighthearted horror, because there is a good deal of humor, tongue-in-cheek, that is at play here in this title.
Yeah, I mean, I will give you that. It's not strictly horror. I think we should qualify it with something else. But for me, those moments of horror, particularly when there's a number of scenes where a corpse, kind of a reanimated corpse, kind of like strikes out at someone or like attacks someone, and for me, those were really the strongest moments in the series. So yeah, I'll give you that there's other things going on that we could talk about, but for me, the really driving force of the series was its horror elements, and the parts of it that really worked were those horror elements.
Yeah.
Though I think I was trying to find, it really reminded me of something, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it, because in the first 2 volumes or so, it's much more horror and oriented. But by the 3rd volume, it kind of drifts away from that, and it's not so much horror. And it does deal with the dead and the undead and things like that. But it's not. It doesn't present them in this horrifying way, or it doesn't use those things to shock or surprise the reader in the way that it had. So I haven't read any more than this, but it appears to be drifting kind of away from that. Sandman. It's a lot like Sandman. How the first couple issues of Sandman were very grounded in the horror genre, but then by the end of the first arc, it was just a fantasy series. This has that same kind of, it starts in one place and then kind of drifts into this other place. Did you find that to be the case, or did you think that 3rd volume was still horror-ish?
I still thought it was horror-ish, and it's funny that you used Sandman as a comparison. I wouldn't have thought that. I can see where you're going with in this particular instance. But I tell you, another title that this reminds me of, in a loose way, is Scooby-Doo.
Oh, absolutely. That's exactly, that is, I was 100 pages in, and I was like, I got to talk to Derek about how much like Scooby-Doo this is.
It is. Shea, you and I have been talking around the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service, but we really haven't discussed what it's about. So if you were trying to encapsulate this to someone who was not familiar with the title, how would you describe it? Like its premise.
A bunch of students at a Buddhist university use their supernatural powers to bring closure to dead people?
Yeah. Or their powers, because some of them are supernatural and some aren't.
Yeah, that's true.
Now, the main character in this book, in the group of students, is Kuro Karatsu. And he is the bald kid that we see on the front of all of the covers. And in fact, the covers are really interesting. You were referencing them earlier. And you can see this to a point with the Omnibus edition, but on the individual volumes that I have, you have this cardstock, as you pointed out, kind of wraparound image where you see the lineup of the characters, and there are, if you do count the puppet, which we'll get to in a minute, there are 6 of them. And it is Kuratsu who is the only one who is looking out, where we can see his face. Everybody else, we see either the back of their head askew, or something obscuring their faces, which I think is a great design element, because they do this at least over the first several volumes. So he is someone who has a power that when he touches dead people, he can have a conversation with them, especially dead people, or I guess it's only dead people who are relatively recently dead and are not yet at rest, or are in some ways do not have a sense of closure with their death. So, for instance, it could be that they died while they were off somewhere else, and they want to be taken home and buried on, next to loved ones, or that they need to be taken someplace in order to have their death avenged, or whatever the case is. So it is Kuratsu who touches them and who has this conversation with the dead people. And so he is a form of what do you call it? An Itako?
The Itako. It's a word that's kind of unfamiliar to me, but I from what I understand, based on the context of the story, that it seems to be kind of like a shaman or a medium.
Yes, a shaman who can communicate about the dead. And from what I've seen in looking that up, they're usually women. So I think it's interesting that Otsuka has Kuratsu, basically, the main character, is the one here. He's a male who does this. So he has a supernatural power. And then another one who has, I guess, the other main one, I'll get to the puppet guy later, who has a supernatural power, is Makoto Numata. And he's a dowser. In other words, he has this pendant that, instead of using it to find things like, let's say, water, it moves in a way when he dangles it, or if it moves, then there is a dead body, or, as we learn in subsequent stories in this omnibus, parts of bodies. And so he has the power, and he and Kuratsu work closely together. Now, the aforementioned puppet guy, this is one of my favorite characters, and I think this is where much of the humor in this book comes from. This is a younger, kind of an unassuming guy named Yuji Yada, and he doesn't have any powers per se, but he all the time has a puppet, a funny-looking puppet on his hand. But it's not just any puppet. It is a puppet that channels this alien from another world, an alien named Kira Ellis. And if it sounds strange, it is. I mean, when you first encounter this in the book, it's almost as if you have to do a double take. And the thing about the alien is he is very foul-mouthed. He really has no sense of propriety. He doesn't care who you are. He'll just speak his mind. And so right there you have a premise that sets up the humorous tone. That is, it can't be exhausted. Really, I mean, that's just a great premise right there.
I'm glad you mentioned Ellis, the alien, because reading, and it might be because I sat down and read the omnibus through in 2 sittings, and so it's 300 pages at once. But I was really, really annoyed with the lettering of that whoever lettered the book gave to Ellis. For people who have read this series, might be familiar with, or people who don't, this alien is his text is given a different font than the other characters, and whatever font they use, it's just it was so difficult to read and so annoying. And he very quickly became my least favorite character.
Oh, really?
Because it became like a chore. Whatever about that font, just it annoyed me. It irritated me, and maybe that's a personal thing. Maybe other people have had the same experience, but I just thought aesthetically it was a bad choice. That font, it felt very cheap. It felt very clunky. It felt it felt harder to read. Particularly with some letters, they just kind of you were unable to tell what they were. But maybe I'm the exception. Maybe I'm just a crazy person. But
no, you're right on all accounts. And in fact, in the first, what is originally the part of the omnibus, that is the first volume, I'm looking on page 167. And I think for all of those reasons that you mentioned, or as you were describing the font, that it is clunky, it doesn't look attractive. I mean, this, for me at least, adds to the tone of the alien speech, because he's supposed to sound gruff and out of context with everything else around him. And so I think the fact that Otsuka and Yamazaki made the font the way that they did just adds to this distinctiveness of the puppet alien character.
See, but I haven't seen the Japanese, so I'm not sure if that was a choice they made or if that was a choice.
That's a good point.
The translators made, and it could very well have been consistent with the different font they used for the characters when it first appeared in Japanese. But I don't know. And I definitely understand like what they were going for. I don't begrudge them their attempt to kind of make him an alienating character. I think there are ways they could have done that without making him just a chore to read, making me understand that he's not only an alien, but he's literally an alien. He's physically alienated from the other elements on the page without making it like ugly, I think.
Yeah. And as you pointed out, he is not only an alien, but alienating for you as a reader.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. But I liked him, and but just because of the humor element. Now, there are two other members of the Corpse Delivery Service. Now, one is a young girl named Kiko Makino, and she has no special power other than being highly trained and skilled at embalming. And in fact, she was trained in the United States. And I did not know this about Japanese culture, but I gather from the book that embalming is not something that you find often.
Yeah, they briefly mention it, that it's in Japan, that the here it's, a lot of people get cremated, but it's traditional and commonplace for people to get buried. But I guess there it's more common for people to get cremated. And if people get cremated, there's no reason for people to be embalmed, and there's no reason to learn embalming. And I don't know how true that is. And obviously the book is, or the stories at least we're reading in these books are, almost 15 years old. So that might have changed, or it might be the same. But yeah, I think that has to do with the prevalence of Buddhism and Shintoism in Japan.
Yeah.
But that's just speculation on my part.
Yeah. Well, actually, the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service began in 2002.
Oh, okay.
So it's not even that old. And in fact, I think it's in the
they mentioned
part of the Omnibus, which I think, which is volume 3. I think that's where this was, that there's a mention of the U.S. invasion of Iraq.
Oh, yeah, that plays a big part in that.
Yes,
story.
It does.
So,
and then the final and fifth or sixth, depending on how you're counting, member of the service is actually the woman who brought everyone together. She's, I guess you could call her the mastermind. She's like the Dr. Xavier, if you will, of the Corpse Delivery Service, and that is Ao Sasaki. We meet her at the very beginning, in the very opening pages of this omnibus, where Karatsu is out where there has been a dead body found, and Sasaki is out there as well. So she meets him, and she's a student at the Buddhist University as well, suggests to him that they form some kind of group to where they can make a few bucks, and that they could, help solve mysteries, especially when it comes to once she learns of his powers, putting dead bodies at rest, so to speak. And then she brings others into it, Numata, Yada, and Makino. So she is the brains behind things, and even though she doesn't have any supernatural powers, she's very intelligent and very skilled at hacking computers and information gathering.
Mm-hmm.
She's also the sexy one of the group.
Yeah, there was. I noticed that we see her very often in kind of lingerie or very skimpy clothes.
Yes.
And so I was surprised. There is one panel in, I believe it's about halfway through the omnibus. I think the second volume or maybe the early parts of the third of the regular paperbacks. Where we see her nude, and so I wasn't, I was a little surprised by that because it is a book where we see more than once fully nude women, but then we see her and she's very kind of skimpily dressed but not nude, and so I just thought they were going to draw out that as a kind of running joke that they're always like hinting at her, almost being nude, but they never show her fully nude. So I will admit to being a little surprised by that. But
it's interesting that you mentioned that. I'd forgotten that there was that one in this omnibus, only one scene where you do see Sasaki nude. Mm-hmm. And you mentioned there are other instances in the book where you find women, not men, but the women who are nude. And in almost every case outside of this,
there's one full frontal male nude shot in the book.
And it's the dead guy, right?
Yeah, but there's a lot more naked women.
Okay, you're right. And except for the Sasaki example, in almost every instance, it's naked women in kinky situations, or what one could consider kinky situations. Now, I tell you, that one nude scene with Sasaki didn't surprise me for this reason. I saw that Otsuka and Yamazaki were leading up to that, and showing her in skimpy outfits, in underwear, in lingerie-like outfits, and even when she dresses to go out in public, she's much more skimpily dressed than the others. Now, obviously, they're not going to show the young girl, the young embalmer, Makino, like that. I mean, she is innocent, she's young, but the times throughout the book when we see Sasaki, more times than not, we can either see her dressed with less, or we can see the contours of her breasts and her nipples. They're much more prominent than with other characters, major or minor, in this book. And so once we got into that last half and there is that nude picture where you do see her breast, it didn't surprise me. I said, okay, well, this is the logical conclusion of where they're going. But I don't think she's not, if we're using the Scooby-Doo analogy, she's not really Daphne, right? But I do think that Otsuka and Yamazaki use her as the one somewhat sexual symbol, if we want to call it that, in this book. But it's not egregious. I don't think it's disturbing to the point that it detracts or would cause anyone to become angry with and or distracted by the story. Or do you?
No, I wouldn't say that. But when you describe her as the sexy one, that did remind me of one of the things I did want to talk about. And I wouldn't argue that she is kind of positioned as being the quote-unquote sexy one. But I was wondering, did you find that was all she was? Because one of my biggest problems with the series was I felt that a lot of the characters, and it is an ensemble series, but most of the characters are very underdeveloped. We don't get a lot of information. We get a little bit about Numata, and we get a little bit about Kuratsu, but we get very little about Yada. We get very, very little about Makino. Just these kind of surface details. Did you find that Sasaki was just kind of the sexy one, or did you think that Otsuka and Yamazaki, they developed her as a character, and did you feel they did that for other characters, or did you feel like it was kind of they were flat or they were underdeveloped?
Well, first off, I would say that Sasaki is not just sexy, but she's smart sexy as well. Mm-hmm. So even though you do get to see parts of her body or suggestions of a body underneath her skimpy clothing, she doesn't come across as a bimbo. She doesn't come across as superficial. She wears glasses. She's a computer expert. She knows what she's doing. She knows how to handle herself. So she's not a throwaway character in that sense. Although I do see where you're going with not only Sasaki, but also with most of the other characters as not being as fully developed, at least in this first omnibus. Mm-hmm. And I have not read beyond the end of this omnibus, which is the third volume. I would just assume, and I have subsequent volumes I need to get to now, but I would just assume that as the story continues, we learn more and more about these characters. I would really be surprised if that's not the case. I'm okay with, within the first 3 volumes, all of which compose the omnibus, of not getting deep into any one character, because as you point out, it's the ensemble that's mm-hmm. the character. It's the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service and all of those guys working together, each bringing something different. There are certain characters like Mikino especially, and even Sasaki to some degree, that we mm-hmm. don't see that frequently. I mean, mm-hmm. to me, the main characters, the ones that we see the most, are by far Kuratsu and Numata, but we also get to see quite a bit of Yada in his puppet Ellis.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I do think they would have to at some point develop these characters, because I mean, there's 20 volumes. So like you said, hopefully they do. But I have nothing but these first 3 volumes to go on. And I would quibble with your reading of it as the kind of ensemble being the main character, because we don't. I didn't really get that either. For me, it felt very plot forward. It felt to emphasize the events rather than the characters. And there are some exceptions. There's one story where we do learn a lot about Sasaki, where we Otsuka and Yamazaki reveal a lot about her character, not necessarily through exposition, but where they place her in very difficult situations and they allow her to make tough decisions that do tell us about her. But it's for the other stories, and Kuratsu gets that a little, but for the other stories, it's very much focused on simply getting a task done is more my complaint. And you see, I mean, I have problems with things like Naruto and Bleach. They're not really my cup of tea, but I will give those series that they are ensemble series that, very quickly, very early on, they emphasize you buying into the character. They spend a lot of time getting you to like that character. And I just didn't feel like Otsuka and Yamazaki were really interested in exploring the character so much as this kind of concept, which was a vehicle to do really kind of gross out stuff.
And I agree with you there. And I wasn't saying that the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service is a primarily character-driven series. I was just saying that within the concept of character, if we limit ourselves to just character, mm-hmm. that instead of any one of those individuals that we've been discussing coming to the fore more than the others, that it's the ensemble, it's the group itself that is like a character. But I definitely agree with you that this is a much more plot-driven or action event-driven mm-hmm. series. And this may change, or mm-hmm. at least the character aspect of it may change in subsequent volumes, because as we learn more about the characters, and again, I'm assuming that we will, then that would give us a fuller feel of who the individuals are, and thus what the entire cast is as a group. But I agree with you that in the fact that it is more plot driven, and I'm fine with that, because given the nature of this, as you know, what we discussed earlier, a horror mm-hmm. title, mm-hmm. a humorous horror title, I feel, then I think that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. See, I felt the opposite. I felt last week, or last month, I should say, I talked about how Oh My Goddess was very soap opera-like, and it benefited from me being able to read, or my reading of it benefited from me being able to consume 700 pages at once, because just the nature of that story and the way it's constructed, it was very comfortable to read these stories and then just go on to the next one and go on to the next one and go on to the next one, because it emphasized melodramatic, like these melodramatic moments and the character moments and humorous moments, and whether or not I thought they were done really well. There was just a comfort in those kind of beats. Whereas this, I thought, was the omnibus format, I thought was a detriment to the story, because, and I might be the exception. Other people might read it one chapter at a time, like you're probably supposed to. But I like to read my books kind of in 1 or 2 sittings, maybe 3 sittings. And I thought just the reading story after story that had the kind of same structure and the same rhythm, and it was just plot. About 200 pages in, I just got really bored with it, and it just became. I kind of was wrestling with whether or not I thought it was a bad series, and I don't think it's fair to call Kurosagi Corpse Delivery bad, but I do think that it suffered from that format, and I do think it was just kind of all right, and there were moments where it was very plotting, and it was, in all honesty, it was probably the least favorite, my least favorite of the books we've looked at for the podcast.
Really?
Yeah, and I think the format, that omnibus format, coupled with the kind of the structure of those stories, had a lot to do with that.
Well, let me ask you, because when you were talking about the events, and in particular the character Sasaki, and I think I know what you're referring to, is that there's one part in this omnibus that we do get to learn more about her than we did in other places. Which of the stories in this omnibus did you appreciate the most? Because, like we mentioned, if it's like Scooby-Doo, then, Scooby-Doo is a series of mysteries, one after the other. They become kind of formulaic. Now, I don't know if it's that this is near as formulaic as Scooby-Doo, but you do have a series of these mysteries that we get one right after the other. So which one stood out for you?
I think in terms of story, that one with Sasaki, it's, I don't want to spoil it for anyone who's reading it, but it's kind of like a big story. I think that the narrative of that was done really well. I think there are some really good moments in that. But I think my favorite moments in this series so far are not whole stories, but I really love those moments when Yamazaki gets to draw like someone on eyes opening real big and them like attacking someone, or stuff like that. In the first couple pages, there's a series of really big shots, establishing shots of someone kind of hanging themselves in the I'm going to mispronounce this, but Aoki Gahari Forest, which is the suicide forest, which is in a later story. But I think there's some really, really good moments in all of the stories. The kind of denouement of all of them allow Yamazaki to draw these really, really fantastic still images. And so, I don't know, I think the Sasaki one was probably the strongest, but I don't know if my favorite parts of this are any whole things. I really, really like pieces of all of them. But what about you?
Yeah, you had mentioned the story with Sasaki, and we're not going to give away any spoilers, but that is the longest story in this omnibus, and actually it takes up the entire second volume. And of the first 3 volumes, the second volume is the thickest. And what the premise to this story is, this group, the Corpse Delivery Service, discovered that there is a funeral home, or a ceremony as it's called, that is getting bodies from prison in order to take care of them, dispose of them, to put them where they need to be. But there's something else going on entirely, and so that's the big mystery that's driving everything in Volume 2, or the middle part of this omnibus. And this is where Sasaki comes into play, because Sasaki and her sister, which we find out that they're orphans because their parents were murdered by someone, and this someone is actually an executed prisoner that we see at the very beginning of Volume 2. And this funeral home or ceremony is making money by giving victims of crimes, the surviving victims, an opportunity for their own kind of justice. And we'll just leave it at that. And I think it is really interesting what Otsuka does with this whole idea of vengeance, or getting what some people call justice, because it does cause you to stop and reflect on, and not just Western, but also apparently Japanese systems of justice that allow for the death penalty. Mm-hmm. If what we read in the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service series is true, apparently in Japan, the victims aren't told when let's say a murderer of a family member is going to be executed. It's handled, but they're not informed. At least that's what I gather from this story.
Yeah, it seems, and I haven't looked into it, so I don't know how true it is or anything like that. But at least in the story, they're not told anything about when the person is going to be executed, but they do receive a letter informing them that it has occurred.
Right.
So they know that it's happened, but they don't. And I think the idea is to give people the opportunity to kind of move on. But some people in the story argue that it keeps them from finding closure, and that's kind of the crux of that.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the reasons why I like that longer middle story in the omnibus. What makes up, in essence, Volume 2 in its entirety, is the fact that I think there's a lot that goes on. It's the most complex of all the stories, but also it does pose quite a number of questions that are ultimately unanswerable. In other words, it's the most thought-provoking story that this group of characters goes through.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's why we both kind of singled it out as the strongest, because you mentioned that it's not as formulaic as the Scooby-Doo ones, but it does have that same kind of, there are familiar rhythms to each of the stories that make up the majority of these volumes, or the omnibus volume, and that was one of the ones that was really dissimilar, I think, in structure and in pacing and in tone from the other ones. And I think that's why we both kind of recognized it as the best one out of all of them.
Yeah. Now, another thing I wanted to mention in terms of the stories in this omnibus, and this is what originally appeared in the third volume, the first two stories of that third section of the omnibus, Crossing the River and Applause. This is the one that we were mentioning that takes place around the time of America's invasion of Iraq, because it actually opens with reference to that, where these five guys are sitting around in a park and they're seeing protesters, people who are protesting U.S. invading Iraq, and it involves someone that they think is dead, but who ends up not being dead, who later becomes dead, who apparently they discover is an Iraqi. And the reason why I wanted to mention this story, I don't know if you felt this way, but after the middle part, the story that we've just been discussing, the one where Sasaki and her sister have to confront this funeral home and some decisions that they have to make about their past, that was a very long story. So, when I first read what makes up the first two stories of the original third volume, Crossing the River and Applause, I thought that this was going to be a much longer story. And when this ends, we see these guys in Iraq, and they're in an armored vehicle on their way to make a delivery. Mm-hmm. I thought there was going to be more to that, and so when I turn the page and get to the next story, X plus Y equals love, I think that's the name of it. It threw me. I thought, well, did they get back from Iraq? What's going on? That just seemed to end rather abruptly. Did you think? Or did you expect it?
I mean, I didn't expect it, and I definitely had that feeling like flipping the page, where it took me a second to realize, like, oh, that was the end, because it's very incongruous with its other endings. It's very different from the way the other stories in the series end.
Right.
But I actually thought that it worked really well. I thought it was the most upbeat and hopeful ending. I thought it was the maybe one of the funnier moments of the series, and I like that it was so different that it did make us both kind of take a second and think about whether or not we were reading the same story or if it had begun another story.
Right.
And I thought it worked really well, and I appreciated that it was, and I like that it was shorter coming off of that longer story, because you got to vary that stuff. I think. But I definitely had that same moment you had, but I really appreciated it, actually.
Well, I know I ask you this in almost every manga episode when it comes to one of the titles in a series. Is this one of those series that you're going to continue with?
I don't know. I probably not. It just didn't really work for me. Like I said earlier, it's probably one of the series that we've done that I liked the least. Not to say, and I think that my biggest problem with it wasn't that it was bad or that I disliked it so much more than everything else we've read. But there was just really nothing about it that really struck me. And it was just a lot of it just kind of fell flat for me. So it wasn't bad so much. It was just kind of in the middle. So for me, probably not. It's not as kooky or crazy as JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, and it's not as scary as Junji Ito comics. So it just.
Yeah, I didn't think that you would go on to read this, given what you were saying earlier. See, I do like this, and I will go on. I like it a lot better than you do, and I know earlier we were discussing that this series reminds us of Scooby-Doo, and I'll tell you another narrative that the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service reminds me of, and that is the Rockford Files. And for this reason, and I'm a big fan of the Rockford Files. I grew up with that in the 70s. In that, Jim Rockford is always just scraping by. He'll take a case for the money, but then something seems to happen where he doesn't get the money. So he's always in need of something. And that's what this group constantly goes through in this omnibus, the first original 3 volumes, is that they think they're going to make money at this. And we see this at the very beginning in that first story in the omnibus. But they're never able to make much of anything. And so what ends up happening is when they have an encounter of some sort at the very beginning of one of these stories, then usually it's Karatsu, or although it could be other characters, who decide to take on the case, so to speak, without payment. With no hope of payment whatsoever, because they're intrigued by the mystery or they're moved by a certain situation. I know I think it's the second story in the omnibus, the one with the dead grandma, as they call her. It's Numata who moves everyone forward to solve this mystery, even though they understand that they probably won't get paid for anything. And so it's this kind of hard luck story that you see in shows like the Rockford Files, because I would call the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service a detective series as well. So it's it's an interesting mix between Scooby-Doo, Rockford Files, horror, detective, investigative narratives. And for that mix, I enjoy it, and I want to go on with this.
Yeah, I think I mentioned it kind of in comparison or kind of contrast to Oh My Goddess, which we talked about in an earlier episode. And I do think that while they are very, very dissimilar in almost every way, I do think both of them fit this very familiar kind of pattern that is very comforting. And like I said last month, and I've said on this episode, I was very comforted by those kind of familiar beats of Oh My Goddess. It's not a book I want to rush out and get because I love so much, but sitting down and reading those 700 pages, it was kind of breezy and enjoyable and funny, and it wasn't the greatest thing in the world, but it was kind of, it gave me kind of comforting feeling that made me want to keep watching it. And so I do totally understand that kind of comfort in seeing those familiar kind of tropes and structures and things like that in this.
Yeah. Well, Shea, you want to move on to the next title we're going to be looking at this month?
Yeah, and I reading this one and reading Kurosagi Corpse Delivery, I realized that they were, not only do they feature bald protagonists, but they're also, I believe, unless I'm forgetting something, they're the first, but they're both series that are written and drawn by two different people, and I don't think we've ever talked about a book before or a manga before that wasn't by just one person.
So yeah, this is One Punch Man, and I think it's written by One?
Yeah.
Someone who goes by One, with art by Yusuke Murata. Mm-hmm. And now this is a title that I was not familiar with until about a month and a half ago. Maybe even longer than that. You had suggested that we do for our September show. Mm-hmm. So you knew about, how did you find out about One Punch Man?
Well, because I know Debe Aoki a little bit, and I know David Brothers a little bit, and I follow Chris Butcher on Twitter, and a couple of my other friends are big. They have Shonen Jump subscriptions, and and so this is like the book. This is the book that everybody talks about. When Viz announced because there are, I think, 4 volumes that are available digitally, but they just started putting them out in print. And when Viz first announced that they were doing the print version, which I was waiting for, because I'm still kind of considering getting a Shonen Jump subscription, but I do like my comics in physical format. So I was kind of holding out for that, and when they announced that, people went crazy, and there's no excuse for you not to read it anymore, and stuff like that. So I'm surrounded by people who were already fans of it, and they had found it because it's serialized in that weekly Shonen Jump.
Yeah. Now we should mention that this began, and I guess it really took off as a webcomic beginning not that long ago in 2009. So, I mean, this hasn't been around for that long.
It's also interesting to note on that topic that this is actually a remake of that, because that originally was written and drawn by One, and I haven't looked at it, but I've heard that it's not a very well drawn comic. But then Yusuke Murata was like, I like your comic. I think it's funny. I want to draw it. And so this one that we're reading is not that webcomic version. It's a remake of that.
Yeah. Well, let me ask this then, since you know more about this title than I do, and I've read the first 2 volumes. The character, the main protagonist, One Punch Man, or Saitama, mm-hmm. The way he is drawn is significantly more cartoony than almost everything else in this series. Now, does the way that Saitama is drawn much more in line with the way that One originally drew it as a webcomic?
I actually haven't seen One's original version, so I couldn't tell you. It would make sense, but I kind of got from it that it was, it was just kind of like humorous design, and it looks, you read that one chapter where he fights the Beast King, the lion, the kind of lion man thing, and you read that hyper detailed double page spread where he's, the Beast King is striking with his like move, in manga. If you read shonen manga, that the characters they always got to tell you what the name of their move, and so he throws down his finishing move, and it's super detailed, and it looks photorealistic, and it's hatched and it's shaded with in all these different hues and gradients, and and then you look at him and his is it's basically like a smiley face.
Yeah.
So what I got from it was just a humorous contrast with all of these. I mean, even his sidekick Genos is this hyper detailed kind of illustratively rendered cyborg. And when his arm opens up into a cannon, and we see every little detail, every little servo, but then you see him, and it's just a smiley face. And
well, you mentioned Genos as a sidekick. I wouldn't call him so much as a sidekick as a disciple wannabe, because Genos is a cyborg. And when he learns of One Punch Man or Saitama, he comes to him and says, I want you to be my master and to teach me how to do the things that you do. And Saitama doesn't want to have anything to do with him. And even by the end of this second volume, and we should mention, I think you've already alluded to it, that in terms of the hardbacks, the paperbacks, the first 2 volumes just this month came out from Viz. Mm-hmm. So even by the end of that, Saitama is keeping a bit of distance between him and Genos the cyborg, which feeds into the humor. Now, I told you that I thought that Kurosagi Quartz Delivery Service was an example of humor horror, and I kept emphasizing the humorous side of that. One Punch Man, it's about all humor.
Yeah, I mean, reading it, I don't really read. I don't know. I know the podcast mainly emphasizes alternative comics, and you kind of shy away from superhero comics. But
we shy away from talking about them, not that we don't read them.
Yeah, that's what I was. I don't know if you don't actually read them, but I don't really read superhero comics because they don't have anything to offer me that the way that I think the ideal way to do superhero comics is not the way that superhero comics are being done. But reading this, I was like, this is what a superhero comic should be. It doesn't take itself too seriously. It's really well drawn. Anyone can kind of pick it up and read it. You don't really need to know all this complex backstory. The stories are kind of brief, but they're not stupid. It's not dumb, but it's not, it doesn't need to be highbrow to be really fun and energetic, and the fights look really good. And it was just kind of that really great blend of accessibility and humor, like you said, and action. And it wasn't too gory or anything. But it was, it was really good fights. And so for me, it was just that really good balance of all of the things that I think a superhero comic should be. Yeah. But humor that it definitely doesn't take itself too seriously.
Oh, exactly. and I think that's putting it lightly. Now, you said that the stories weren't stupid. I think that they're stupid, but they're intentionally stupid, and that's part of the humor. Now, there's a part of me...
I think there's a difference between goofy, very intentionally goofy, and stupid.
I see where you're going. So, yeah, you feel more comfortable with the word goofy. Okay, I'll grant you that. There's a part of me a moment ago that was tempted to, when you were describing this, say, yeah, it's something fun, humorous, self-conscious, like you would find in Grant Morrison. And I'm almost tempted to make that comparison, but it's really something different. I don't think it is as clever, let's say, as Grant Morrison. And a lot of people have a problem with Grant Morrison's cleverness. They think that he's a little too self-conscious and too in the know of what he's doing, and relies too heavily on the wink-wink to the reader. I think there's some of that going on in One Punch Man, but you're right. I mean, the gist of this series, and I've only read what is in the first 2 volumes here that just recently were released. It's making fun of, in an affectionate way, these kind of heroic adventures, and it could be superhero comics if we're talking about American, or it can be some of the action manga as well, because what One is doing here, and it's funny to refer to the author as One in a title called One Punch Man, is playing off many of the tropes, the stereotypes, the expectations of what the reader has, and really having a laugh at the genres, plural, the genres' expense, but in a good-natured way, not putting it down, not denigrating these kind of stories, but just having fun with it. So now, for instance, when I think it's just hilarious that we learned fairly early on in the first volume that One Punch Man, and he's called One Punch Man because he can basically take out an opponent in one punch. I mean, he's that good.
I mean, when you say take out, he takes their heads off.
Yeah, exactly. And that has made him kind of bored. And he's doing a superhero kind of out of the goodness of his heart. He just wants to. It's kind of a hobby for him, right? And but it's become so easy for him to defeat opponents that there's nothing exciting about it anymore. And so he almost goes into this out of some kind of obligation. It's like, okay, I'll do it, but I really get nothing out of it. And so he wants that excitement, but it's just not exciting anymore. And we may wonder why he's bald. Well, we learned, I think it's in the second story in this volume, in the first volume, that he went through, after his first adventure, which included a young kid with this gigantic cleft chin. And of course, we see the guy's grandfather later on in Volume 2, briefly. But and just that kid looks funny. But anyway, so Saitama saves this young kid, and this is like 3 years previous to where One Punch Man opens. But we learned that in that time, he has basically decided to be a hero and has gone through intense training. So intense that it's caused him to lose his hair. And there's no explanation of what the hell that means, and that's part of the humor. And he'll bring this up every now and again. I trained so long and so hard that I lost my hair. Well, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't have to mean anything outside of being kind of incongruous and funny.
I mean, but we do. And then I think that joke is made even better when we find out what actually his training consisted of.
Exactly, and it's all part of the joke. It's not that it's playing on our expectations of superhero comics and I guess something similar in manga. You would expect there to be some kind of grand, unique, unbelievable way that a character got his or her power. Like, for instance, they came from another planet and there was a different kind of sun, or that they were hit by lightning, or they were knocked in the head by a canister of radioactive whatchamacallit. I mean, any number of things, or a spider bit them on the ass. The kind of things that we've come to expect from superhero origins. But Saitama's origin is, well, he just worked out and was good at it.
Yeah.
That's basically it.
You mentioned earlier you kind of compared, you made a Grant Morrison comparison, and you said that this was kind of playing on the tropes of superhero comics, and it's totally accurate. And we give a lot of credit to things like The Authority or Watchmen or Doom Patrol, things like that do it, and they take it in a very serious direction. But I think
Doom Patrol serious.
I think there are some serious parts of Doom Patrol. Okay. It gets dark.
Okay, it does. Okay, Authority much more serious.
Oh yeah, Authority. Well, Authority is much bloodier, but I think this is really the kind of ideal. I do love Doom Patrol. Don't get me wrong; it's one of my favorite superhero comics. But I think this is we give those so much credit, and I think that's when people want to kind of reinvent the superhero wheel. That is kind of the thing they look to. But not everyone can do it very well, and most people don't do it. They don't add anything. They're just kind of rehashing those kind of subversions. But I would really like to see more people do this. It's so far in the opposite direction that it's good. I think it is almost the antithesis of something like Watchmen, but I think it's done so well, and I would really love to see people emulating this rather than that kind of dour thing, because that emulation gave us the New 52, and it gave us a DC comic where Frankenstein sews Black Canary's head into his intestines. That's super gross, and I don't want to read that comic. But I wish this was kind of the thing they were looking to instead of just that very serious version of this.
Yeah, you mentioned Watchmen. If Alan Moore didn't take himself seriously, you may have something like One Punch Man. And it is funny because there are times that, we've been talking about superheroes, but you could say the same thing about a lot of shonen, in that you find you've already alluded to it, very detailed art when it comes to the fighting scenes. I mean, to the point that there are some places in these first two volumes that were kind of so busy visually that they were difficult to read. There's so much action going on and presented as such a visual position or angle that at times I had a hard time figuring out what was going on, but that's all part of the movement that's going on, and that's what you'll find in a lot of shonen. Is there a lot of intense fight scenes, and kind of similar to Marvel Comics, where the fight itself becomes the story, and it takes place over such a long number of pages. It becomes almost very choreographed, like a ballet in a way, that you can get lost in something like that. And I think that One and Murata were making fun of that in many of the fight scenes that we see, because if you think that with a lot of shonen fight scenes, the popular stuff like Dragon Ball Z or other such titles, or you think that in Marvel Comics it seems to be about 50 to 80% fighting, the heroes fighting each other, then what One Punch Man does is it cranks it up a notch. It turns that kind of, if you want to call it ridiculous convention up to 11.
Yeah, it definitely is playing with shonen tropes too, and I think you might have something with the fights that it's kind of playing with the length of fights. I mean, it definitely is making a point of kind of positioning those fights as these things that are going to run like traditional shonen fights, which are we're not going to get into it, but for economic reasons, are only make sense in manga. They don't make sense in American comics. And then he kind of blows that up with these kind of just one punch fights. So definitely there is something there. But it's interesting to see One and Murata kind of playing on not just the tropes of American comics and not just the tropes of manga comics, but it's playing on the tropes of both, and it's kind of making fun of both. And it's something we've seen kind of where we see people kind of bringing in the iconography and the things we tend to associate with manga into American comics and using them to poke fun at things in American comics, or just poking fun at them. But, and someone could be listening to this, and, I could be totally wrong and they could correct me. But to my knowledge, it's much, much rarer, and it's a much more recent phenomenon to see the Japanese blending that kind of parody of both Japanese comics and American comics.
Yes. Let me ask you something. We were talking about the way that this plays off of both shonen and the superhero genre. They do the same thing with the villains. They even take some of these evil forces to extremes, and I think the best example of that is what we get toward the last part of Volume 1 and then into the second volume, and that is the House of Evolution. And we find out that some of the characters that we had encountered earlier, like, for instance, I can't remember her name, but the Mosquito Woman, were actually part of the House of Evolution, or at least they were associated with this. It's rather elaborate, but it's also kind of ridiculous, too, this villain force. But there's one that stood out to me. One, I don't know if you want to call her a villain, or him, I guess. And this leads to my question. And that is the adversary, Speedo Sound Sonic. It's just a ridiculous name. You know, we were talking about Bat Manga last month about how some of those names were of the villains were kind of funny and unlikely. And here we have one is intentionally playing with the name of an opponent, Speedo Sound Sonic. When you first read this character, did you think that that was a woman?
Oh, yeah, 100%.
And they kept referring to him as he, and it threw me.
I totally read that character as being a woman, and a lot of that is just both of us have been conditioned to read certain facial features as feminine and feminine as woman, and but it was totally the kind of shape of his face, his what appeared to be lipstick, his facial features, they read to me as being a woman.
And you know, I mean, I don't think for me it was so much the facial features, because you know, with manga I'm used to feminized human male faces, because you'll find that often, not all the time, but often. And what threw me was the hair and also the shape of the body. It had much more of an hourglass shape to it. I mean, not, you know, Raquel Welch voluptuous kind of hourglass shape, but it did have much more of a feminine form than masculine. And then the way that the hair was put up, again, it just seemed like, now, you know, it could be a male with long hair, having him put his hair up like that, which is apparently what the case was, but it just looked feminine. And so all of those things together, along with the facial features, as you mentioned, led me to think that this was a female opponent, but who wasn't apparently.
Yeah, I was definitely thrown by that as well. And yeah, you're right. The hair, it was I don't know if that was intentional or what, because usually, you know, you read a lot of like BL manga, which is, you know, yaoi and boys love manga, where it's very quote unquote pretty boys. It's like, I mean, it's gay love stories between two men, and that particular genre is usually created by women for the consumption of women, and the men are usually drawn very feminine, hairless, very very pretty. I think is the best word to describe it. But even in those, you can definitely tell that they're men. So that definitely threw me when reading it. The hair, the facial features, the kind of body, the stance. It definitely, you know, even those kind of more effeminate men are drawn to be clearly masculine in a lot of the manga that I've encountered. So I was definitely thrown by that as well.
Yeah. Now, I was asking you if you would go on to read the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service, and, you know, I don't think you're going to, whereas I would. I feel a little opposite about One Punch Man. I'm not sure if I'm going to continue reading this. I appreciate it. I like it. But by the time I got to the end of the second volume, I was starting to feel that this was a joke that definitely not played out, but it's not covering new territory. So I'm wondering at what point might the humor of One Punch Man begin playing itself out to where it just seems like the same old, same old. I don't think it's there yet, but I was starting to get the sense by the end of the second volume that it wasn't doing anything different, that it was the same kind of self-conscious mocking of, you know, certain genres, superhero and, you know, shonen. Did you feel that way?
No, I think we're kind of, you know, reversed from our positions on Kurosagi Corpse Delivery. I really liked it. I totally agree with you that I don't think it's necessarily covering new ground, but I really appreciated how well it was covering that ground. I thought Yusuke Murata draws exceptionally well, and he's really well suited to the material. He can balance that humor and that action really well. I just thought it was, like I said, it was. I'm not averse to superheroes because I hate superheroes. I'm averse to superheroes because 99% of the way they've been done over the last 20 years is just it's not great. I don't enjoy the actual material. Not necessary. It's not the genre. It's the material. But this is totally a superhero comic that I would read. It's totally the kind of disposable, ephemeral seeming content that fits really well into superheroes, and it's, I don't know if I would, I'm going to anticipate the release of each volume like I anticipate the release of like Sunny, or I'm anticipating the release of I think Viz or Vertical has some Inio Asano books coming out next year that I'm really excited about. But I would definitely read the other volumes. I definitely look forward to seeing it pop up. From what I understand, it's serialized really infrequently in the Weekly Shonen Jump. But if I had a subscription to that, I'd be really keen to read it in there. I actually think that's like an ideal format for it.
Yeah, and the way that you were describing it, it's something that I could pick up and put down and enjoy, right? Mm-hmm. And so for that reason, I would like to read it, but I don't know if I'm going to buy any additional volumes of this from Viz.
Mm-hmm. Well, I liked it enough that I'll definitely keep an eye out for it, and when they come out, I'll pick them up. But like I said, it's not. I like it and I enjoy it, and I'm going to continue to read it. But it's not something I'm going to be. It's something like I wake up on that Tuesday or Wednesday whenever it comes out, and I'm like, I gotta get this. I gotta rush out to the store and pick it up. But I'll definitely make sure I keep an eye out for it to know when it comes out, so I can continue to read it.
Well, there you go. Two very different titles that we discussed for the month of September. We started off with the Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service, the first omnibus. This is by Eiji Otsuka and Housui Yamazaki. And then we moved on from there to One and Yusuke Murata's One Punch Man, those first two volumes that just a little while ago came out from Viz. So two different titles, two different experiences that each of us have had with them. And I like both, don't get me wrong. I mean, even though I may not consciously go out and look for, new volumes of One Punch Man, I still want to continue with it in some form.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for me, just the Yusuke Murata's art alone is really, really phenomenal, and I'll keep reading it just for that, because it's kind of a cut above. It's definitely a cut above most of the art I'm seeing on most American comics. So, that is a selling point for me by itself.
Yes, and if you want to find out titles such as this that we've been discussing on the show, then you can pre-order future volumes when they come out from the sponsor of the podcast, and that is Discount Comic Book Service. That's dcbservice.com. Go there, and you're going to find some great discounts. Or if you go to their sister company, In Stock Trade, you will find many of the books that we were discussing, Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service and One Punch Man, at impressive discounts. So, for instance, I went to the website just now, and I typed in Kurosagi Corpse Delivery Service, and the omnibus, In Stock Trades has it for 45% off cover price. So instead of paying $19.99, you can get it for $10.99. And this is not an anomaly. This is not unusual. You'll find discounts like this all the time from both In Stock Trades and Discount Comic Book Service. So go there. You will not be disappointed. And after you do get your comics there, manga and otherwise, get in touch with us and let us know what you're reading. We'd like to hear from you in that way. If you go to our website, comicsalternative.com, you should see on the right-hand side of your browser window a tab that says Send Voicemail. Click on that, and from the comfort of your own desktop or mobile device, you can send us a recorded audio message through the wonders of SpeakPipe. It's very simple and easy to use. Or you can call us the old-fashioned way, as always. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427. You can also email us. We're two guys at comicsalternative.com, or you can email me directly. I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com. And Shea, how can they get in touch with you?
I am Shea at comicsalternative.com.
Makes sense to me. You can also find us on Twitter. We're at the number 2 guys with PhDs. And you can find us as well on Facebook, on Tumblr, on Instagram, on Google+, and on Pinterest. We even have a YouTube channel, so you can listen to our episodes that way. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes. You can stream us on Stitcher. You can also find us on TuneIn. And you can find every single one of our episodes, as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at the website comicsalternative.com. A lot of ways for people to contact us, Shea.
Yeah, like I say every month, all you guys need to do is set up a P.O. box and a fax machine, and you've got all the ways.
That's right. And maybe that'll be for the future. Who knows? So Shea and I enjoy these monthly manga shows, and we will be back toward the end of October to talk about 2 completely different titles. Until then, I'm Derek.
And I'm Shea.
We'll see you then.